What if the real turning point of this entire war has already happened, quietly, without a single headline announcing it? What if the piece of land Putin once called his greatest triumph is now slowly becoming the thing that breaks him? Before I show you exactly what is unfolding on Crimea right now, do 3 quick things. Hit like, hit subscribe, and send this to one person who still thinks this war is frozen in a stalemate. Because after this video, they will think differently. Crimea is not just another region on a map. It is the emotional core of this entire conflict. President Zelensky has said over and over that taking Crimea back is Ukraine's most important war goal, the one that matters more than any other, and there is a real reason for that. This peninsula stretches into the Black Sea and wraps around part of the Sea of Azov, which makes it one of the most valuable pieces of territory in the whole region. Whoever controls Crimea controls the shipping routes that the entire world depends on. For Vladimir Putin, this war did not really begin in 2022. It began in 2014, the moment Russian forces seized Crimea. Everything that came afterward was built on top of that single moment. The naval ports on the peninsula, the ability to project Russian power across the Black Sea, the entire logistical backbone that supports operations on the southern front. All of it flows directly from Crimea. In other words, Crimea is not just territory to Putin. It is the heartbeat of Russia's entire southern war effort. And when a heartbeat starts to weaken, everything connected to it starts to weaken too. Here is where the story becomes genuinely fascinating, because the situation on the ground has changed dramatically in just the last few months. Ukrainian drones can now strike air bases, air defense systems, and the power grid on the peninsula almost every single day. On July 15th, the strategic port city of Kerch was plunged into total darkness after a wave of coordinated attacks. This is the city sitting at the very center of Russia's connection to the mainland, and even it could not be protected. Even the head of the Russian occupation administration was forced to admit something remarkable in public. He said that right now it is simply not possible to draw up a power distribution map that evenly supplies electricity across Crimea. Stop and think about that for a moment. The man running the region admitted openly that the lights cannot reliably stay on anymore. And here's the detail that changes everything about how we should read this war. If Ukraine manages to fully isolate the peninsula, the massive Kerch bridge will eventually become useless, and Crimea will be completely severed from the Russian mainland. The direction of this entire war may hinge on that one outcome, because Putin is fighting desperately to protect Crimea and every lifeline that keeps it connected to Russia. And as long as that fight continues, real and lasting peace stays out of reach. This is not just a bold theory pulled from a map. Retired U.S. Army Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, who has studied this war closely for years, holds the exact same view. According to Hodges, as long as Russia holds Crimea, Ukraine can never truly be free in the Black Sea, and this war can never end in a genuine, lasting peace. But perhaps the most striking part of Hodges' argument goes even further. In his view, the fate of Crimea is not only a Ukrainian problem, it is an equation that directly affects the security of all of Europe and the wider Black Sea region. This sea is not simply a battlefield. It is a critical waterway carrying a huge share of Russia's oil and grain exports. And it is where new trade routes connecting Asia and Europe come together. Any instability here sends shockwaves outward, from food security in North Africa to energy supplies across Europe. And along the western coast of this sea sit Turkey, Romania, and Bulgaria, 3 NATO members. So whatever happens on Crimea has a direct impact on the security of the alliance's entire southeastern flank. This is not just an abstract theory floating around expert circles either. It found real, concrete expression at the NATO summit in July 2026. The final statement from that summit explicitly highlighted the alliance's unity in defending Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, language that directly includes the annexation of Crimea, something international law has never recognized. On top of that, allied nations pledged more than 70 billion euros in military support for Ukraine for 2026 alone, and Black Sea security was placed right at the top of the priority list for the alliance's southern flank. So Hodges' idea that Crimea matters to the entire West is no longer just one man's opinion. It has become a reality recognized at the highest levels of NATO itself. And this whole picture explains exactly why the issue is so critical. If Russia is allowed to keep what it gained by annexing Crimea, this will not remain a simple territorial dispute between 2 countries. It would set a dangerous precedent for other powers watching closely around the world, sending a clear signal that borders can be redrawn by force, and the world will eventually just accept it. This is exactly why Hodges insists Ukraine must bring Crimea back under its own control. And when it comes to actually retaking the peninsula, he has laid out a clear roadmap built around 3 distinct phases. The most fascinating part of this roadmap is that it is not some abstract theory sitting in a policy paper somewhere far from the battlefield. It matches almost perfectly with the steps Ukraine has actually been taking, so closely that the systematic campaign Ukraine launched back in April even has its own name among military analysts, the Mid-Range Strike Campaign. The core idea behind the entire plan can be summed up in one sentence: weaken the enemy before you try to take ground. That logic splits the plan neatly into 3 stages. The first phase is isolation. The goal is simple but absolutely crucial: cut Crimea off from the Russian mainland and effectively turn it into an island. To understand why this matters, you need to understand how Crimea actually receives its supplies. There are really only 2 major lifelines feeding the entire peninsula. The first is a land corridor stretching nearly 600 kilometers from Russia's Rostov region down into Crimea. The second is the infamous Kerch bridge, along with its supporting ferry routes. Ukraine has been targeting both of these arteries at the same time, for months, without pause, and the results along that land corridor are remarkable. According to Robert Brovdy, commander of Ukraine's unmanned systems forces, Russian military logistics traffic along this corridor dropped by 71% in just 2 weeks. Russia tried protecting its fuel convoys with mobile air defense teams riding alongside them, but it barely made a difference. Here is where the real genius of this campaign becomes visible, in the simple economics of it. The Baba Yaga class, drones Ukraine uses to strike bridges and logistics targets, cost less than $50,000 each. Compare that to a Storm Shadow cruise missile, which used to do the same job for around $2 million. In other words, Ukraine can now strike far more often, using far cheaper weapons, and the results show up everywhere on the ground. The Chonhar and Henichesk bridges connecting Crimea to the mainland have been hit repeatedly, along with the railway bridges crossing the North Crimean Canal. In June, oil terminals at the ports of Kerch and Kavkaz suffered heavy damage, and all 3 major ferries operating across the strait were struck directly and knocked out of action. And then came perhaps the most impressive move of the entire campaign so far. In the first 2 weeks of July alone, 136 ships transporting fuel to Crimea across the Sea of Azov and the Black Sea were struck. Many of these belong to the so-called Shadow Fleet, vessels specifically used to dodge international sanctions. If this level of detail is exactly why you come back to this channel, do one small thing right now. Tap subscribe and turn on notifications, because what comes next is even more intense, and you really do not want to miss it. The single biggest factor making all of this possible is Ukraine's breakthrough weapon in the Black Sea, naval drones. These surface drones striking ships in the Sea of Azov and threatening bridges directly represent one of the greatest examples of asymmetric warfare in this entire conflict. Models like Ukraine's Magura series cost only a few $100,000, yet they have managed to sink Russian warships worth hundreds of millions of dollars. In fact, these drones have hit close to a third of Russia's entire Black Sea fleet, forcing the Russian Navy to abandon its legendary home port of Sevastopol and seek shelter in Novorossiysk instead. But even that retreat did not give the Russian Navy a truly safe harbor. On July 14th, the Ukrainian Navy struck a Russian FSB border patrol vessel named Sergei Kotov off the coast of Novorossiysk. After being hit by a Sea Baby-class naval drone, the ship sank beneath the waves. And this was not just any random target picked at will. This roughly 750-ton vessel reportedly played a role in the infamous 2018 incident where Ukrainian boats were seized in the Kerch Strait. So Ukraine did not simply send another Russian ship to the bottom of the sea, it settled an old score at the exact same time. And these platforms keep evolving with every passing month. The newest generations of these drones can now fire surface-to-air missiles and have even shot down Russian fighter jets mid-flight. Here's the key point worth remembering as we move forward. Ukraine's asymmetric arsenal is only going to grow larger, backed by that $70 billion Euro commitment pledged at the summit, and every month brings sharper, cheaper, or more capable weapons into this fight. The second phase of Hodge's plan is about making the peninsula simply impossible for Russia to hold on to. The method is straightforward. Turn Russia's military and civilian infrastructure on Crimea into an unbearable burden through relentless drone and missile strikes, over and over, until the cost of holding on outweighs any benefit. The most devastating example of this phase happened in mid-July. On the night of July the 15th, the strike mentioned earlier took place. A massive wave of drones plunged the strategic port city of Kerch into total darkness. But the most striking part of that attack was the domino effect it triggered afterward. Once the power went out, the pumping stations that kept water pressure running also shut down completely. As a result, water supply was cut off entirely in several districts, not just in Kerch, but also in Bakhchaisarai, Armyansk, Saki, and Feodosia. The fact that this strike was so destructive was no accident, because just one day earlier, Ukraine had already delivered a heavy blow to the peninsula's energy backbone. That night, Ukrainian special forces working alongside local resistance units carried out a precision strike on the Balaklava thermal power plant in Sevastopol. using jet-powered kamikaze drones flown with pinpoint accuracy. The strike targeted the plant's main turbine hall, specifically the cooling system of a Siemens-built gas turbine. Reports suggest repairs could take anywhere from 2 to 5 months to complete. This was not a random target either. Balaklava, together with the Tavriska power plant in Simferopol, supplied around 90% of the entire peninsula's electricity needs. In reality, these two heavy blows were only the culmination of a systematic campaign that had been building for weeks before that. Late in June, Ukraine struck the power plant in Simferopol along with the main substation in Sevastopol, leaving the region's largest city and a huge portion of the peninsula without electricity for extended periods. In the first days of July, strikes on the Saki and Belbek air bases damaged or destroyed roughly 7 Russian fighter jets in a single sweep, and hangars housing Shahed drones were destroyed alongside them. The pressure reached such a breaking point that the occupation administration was forced to stop selling fuel to civilians on Crimea entirely, and even declared a state of emergency across the region. The weight of this entire situation made an admission from the very top unavoidable. As mentioned earlier, the head of the Russian administration in Crimea openly admitted that the peninsula's basic life support systems are now operating right on the edge of collapse. Gasoline was only available if residents got lucky that day. Electricity only flowed if the infrastructure had not been struck recently, and water only ran if there was still enough pressure left somewhere in the system. Once expected to be Putin's fortress, an unshakable symbol of strength, Crimea is no longer a symbol of stability at all. It has become an increasingly heavy strategic and economic burden for Russia to carry, one that grows heavier with every passing week. The third and final phase is liberation, meaning Ukrainian ground forces physically move onto the peninsula and take control of it. According to Hodges' logic, this phase can only happen once the first two have succeeded enough, because defeating a Russian force that has already been cut off logistically and worn down continuously will be far less costly in lives than trying to do it while that force is still fully supplied and dug in. That said, even Ukraine openly admits it is not at this stage yet. In the words of Major General Viktor Yahun from Ukrainian intelligence, the current goal of the campaign is not a ground offensive to retake Crimea, but rather making the occupation as difficult and as expensive as possible for Russia to sustain over time. Either way, the troop buildup required for a full-scale ground assault simply does not exist right now, and building it would take considerable time. And this is where a geographic reality that most people completely overlook becomes important. Getting to Crimea by land is nowhere near as simple as it looks on a map at first glance. The only land connection to the Ukrainian mainland is a narrow strip known as the Isthmus of Perekop, which is only about 5 to 7 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. On one side sits the Black Sea, and on the other lies the notorious Sivesh wetlands, known locally as the Rotten Sea. This narrow strategic bottleneck is essentially a gift to whoever is defending it, because while the attacking army gets funneled into this tight corridor, the defenders can concentrate all their firepower on one single predictable choke point. Since 2014, Russia has reinforced this natural advantage to its absolute limit. It has turned the narrow neck of the isthmus into a genuine fortress, complete with trenches, anti-tank ditches, concrete obstacles known as Dragon's Teeth, and massive minefields stretching for kilometers. A Ukrainian ground advance here, even at peak military strength, would be an extraordinarily bloody and grinding operation, the kind that could cost thousands of lives for very little ground gained. There is, however, one critical possibility that Hodges points to directly. If the first two phases succeed in making Crimea unbearable enough to hold, it is entirely possible that Russia could withdraw voluntarily without this final phase ever requiring a brutal ground battle at all. So step by step, patiently, the groundwork for that outcome is being laid. If you have made it this far into the story, you clearly care about understanding this war properly and not just skimming headlines. So let's keep going, because what comes next reveals something the Kremlin has been trying very hard to hide, and it might be the most telling sign of all about where this is heading. The best way to judge whether a strategy is actually working is to look closely at how the other side is reacting to it. And the latest signals coming out of occupied Crimea point to something far beyond ordinary unrest inside the Russian leadership. At the top levels of the administration, there appears to be a quiet, unspoken acknowledgement that the ship is sinking. The clearest evidence of this picture came from striking intelligence that surfaced in early July. According to the pro-Ukrainian partisan movement known as Atesh, occupation administrations in Crimea's two most important port cities, Kerch and Feodosia, received an urgent instruction directly from Moscow. According to that instruction, all valuable documents and technical equipment were to be prepared for evacuation by a specific date, no exceptions. And this order was not limited to a single city either. The same directive was reportedly sent out to numerous other occupation units scattered across the peninsula. Again, according to Tesh, several senior officials with privileged access to fuel suddenly fell ill right after this directive was issued, took sick leave almost immediately, and traveled to Krasnodar on the mainland. At a time when fuel on Crimea is essentially worth its weight in gold, the fact that the privileged few with guaranteed access to that scarce fuel were the very first ones to flee is one of the clearest signs of genuine panic setting at the upper levels of the administration. And this exodus actually began much earlier and much higher up the chain of command than most people realize. According to Ukrainian sources, officers from the Black Sea Fleet had already started quietly relocating their own families to Novorossiysk without even waiting for official orders to do so. One line that summed up the situation perfectly went something like this: ordinary citizens were told to stay calm and carry on, while the occupation structures themselves were already quietly preparing escape routes for their own inner circles. This panic was not confined to administrative corridors and government offices either. Daily life on the peninsula itself began to visibly shake under the pressure. Forced by mounting Ukrainian strikes, the occupation regime had to declare a state of emergency across the entire peninsula, not just isolated districts. Fuel sales to ordinary civilians were stopped completely, with whatever remained reserved strictly for state and military services only. In cities like Sevastopol, ordinary citizens were rationed down to just 20 liters of gasoline per week, barely enough for basic daily errands. On a peninsula that has been a beloved vacation destination for generations of Russian families, this year's entire tourist season was effectively canceled outright. Even summer camps for children were shut down, and roughly 80% of hotel reservations across the region were canceled. Perhaps the most symbolic image to come out of this entire situation was the long lines that formed again and again on the Kerch Bridge itself. Lines where the people trying to leave the peninsula stood out far more noticeably than the people trying to get in. A quiet but unmistakable signal about which direction confidence was flowing. Why all of these signs matter so much comes down to the deep symbolic weight this issue carries for Putin personally. Because for him, Crimea is not just an ordinary piece of territory sitting on a map somewhere. It is the crowning achievement of his entire rule, the living symbol of what he sees as a resurrected empire. This is exactly why figures like Ukrainian Army General Mykola Malomuch argue that losing Crimea would not just be a military defeat on paper, it would be a blow that shakes the authority of Putin's regime directly to its foundation, and could very well signal the beginning of its end. While this entire picture looks promising for Ukraine, and understandably exciting for anyone hoping for a swift resolution, it is important to stay grounded and look honestly at the other side of the coin. Because between isolating Crimea and physically retaking it lies a very long and deeply uncertain road, one with no guaranteed timeline. Even Ukraine's own presidential office openly acknowledges this reality. The peninsula is not yet fully isolated. Only the number of reliable supply routes has been sharply reduced so far, not eliminated entirely, and there are solid, concrete reasons behind this ongoing resilience. Chief among them, the infamous Kerch Bridge is still standing tall, and Russia has surrounded it with one of the densest air defense shields anywhere in this entire war. Over the years, the area around the bridge has been transformed into a genuine multi-layered fortress. In the air, the sector is protected by one of the most concentrated air defense networks found anywhere in the world, with numerous S-400 Panzer and Buk systems, and even Russia's most advanced S-500 system, all deployed together in tandem. 30-meter-tall steel. Towers were built specifically on Tuzla Island to mount Pantsir systems on top, extending their radar range and reach even further out over the water. At sea, a physical barrier has been constructed against Ukrainian naval drones, floating and sunken barges, steel netting protecting the bridge's support piers, sea mines, and interconnected cable barriers have sealed off the passage channels almost entirely, leaving only a single narrow corridor still open for traffic. On top of all that, smoke screens are deployed to confuse incoming missile systems, and electronic warfare systems actively jam the satellite navigation of approaching munitions before they can find their target. Despite this genuinely impressive shield, Ukraine has still managed to strike the bridge repeatedly in 2022, again in 2023, and once more in 2025. The 2025 strike actually used around 1,100 kilograms of explosives placed carefully underwater. And yet, even these impressive, carefully planned attacks achieved little more than heavy damage rather than total destruction. For permanent destruction to actually happen, the same coordinates would need to be hit again and again before Russia gets the chance to complete repairs, breaking through that same multi-layered defense system every single time it tries. And each attempt burns through expensive, genuinely limited missiles that could otherwise be used against entirely different targets elsewhere on the battlefield. Russia's ability to adapt quickly should not be underestimated either. no matter how much pressure is applied. For every logistics line that gets hit, Moscow moves fast to build an alternative. When bridges get damaged, they build pontoon crossings almost immediately and expand ferry operations to compensate. They are even constructing a brand new railway line, stretching hundreds of kilometers. From Rostov all the way to Crimea, running through occupied territory the entire way. Add to that the sobering reality that Phase 3, the actual ground offensive, is still a long way off on any realistic timeline. And here's perhaps the most dangerous side of this whole picture, the part that keeps analysts up at night. A cornered Russia is an unpredictable Russia. Some figures, including Ukrainian Army General Malamud, warn that Putin could reach for extreme measures if pushed far enough, threatening tactical nuclear weapons to hold on to Crimea, or trying to force a compromise by offering to halt attacks elsewhere in exchange for Ukraine easing pressure, on the peninsula specifically. That said, a balanced view is genuinely needed here, not just fear-driven speculation. Many Western analysts believe this nuclear risk should not be overstated or sensationalized. As the Atlantic Council has pointed out clearly, Putin has made nuclear threats before, more than once, even explicitly stating publicly that he was not bluffing at the time. And yet, when Ukraine liberated Kherson in 2022, and when drones attacked the Black Sea Fleet directly and repeatedly, the threatened retaliation never actually came. In those very moments of visible humiliation, Putin consistently chose to quietly back down instead of escalating further. On top of that, according to a 2026 U.S. intelligence assessment, Russia's actual use of nuclear weapons is only considered genuinely likely if the direct survival of the regime itself is threatened, not simply embarrassed. A fuel crisis, or a collapsed tourist season, however painful domestically, falls well below that particular threshold. In short, while the threat itself is real and should never be dismissed entirely, it is far too early to jump straight to worst-case, world-ending scenarios based on current evidence. Perhaps the most critical vulnerability in this entire strategy, though, is how much it depends on outside help continuing steadily. A significant part of Ukraine's need for long-range weapons and detailed intelligence still depends heavily on Western support, and the future of that support is never fully guaranteed year to year. It is exactly at the intersection of these strengths and these weaknesses that several very different possible futures start to appear in front of us, each one plausible in its own way. The first and most important question worth asking is this. If Ukraine truly completes the isolation and makes Crimea genuinely unlivable for Russian forces stationed there, what does Russia actually do next? There are really two main possibilities on the table. Either Russia stubbornly continues defending the peninsula regardless of cost, with expenses rising exponentially every single day that passes, or just like it did in Kherson before, it swallows the humiliation and quietly withdraws from Crimea altogether without a final dramatic battle. That second scenario shows just how much is genuinely at stake for Moscow beyond the immediate military picture. Losing Crimea would not be some routine territorial loss that fades from memory within a year. It would mean the simultaneous end of Russia's military dominance in the Black Sea region and a devastating blow to the image of invincibility that Putin has spent decades carefully constructing around himself and his rule. And the domestic political fallout from that second blow, the psychological one, could end up being even more severe and long-lasting than the military defeat itself. The third scenario looks directly ahead into the coming months and years. If Western support continues without any major interruption, this strategy could dig deep enough over time to genuinely wear Russia down and eventually force it to the negotiating table on far less favorable terms than it currently enjoys. But if that support slows down, gets delayed, or stops altogether for political reasons back home in allied countries, the isolation of Crimea might never actually be completed, and the war could slide right back into a bloody, grinding standoff with no clear end in sight. In short, under the right set of conditions, all lining up together, Hodge's plan genuinely has the power to change the entire course of this war. Whether all of those conditions actually come together at the same time, though, remains far from certain, and depends on decisions being made right now in capitals far from the battlefield itself. So here's the question worth sitting with long after this video ends. If Crimea really does fall, either through collapse or quiet withdrawal, does the grand story Putin spent decades building on the single peninsula collapse right along with it? Share your honest thoughts in the comments below. Tell us which of these scenarios you personally think is most likely to unfold, and if this video finally gave you a clearer picture of what is really happening in this war beneath the surface, make sure you are subscribed, because we will keep tracking every single development as this story continues to unfold in real time. Thank you for watching all the way through, and we will see you in the next one.